Well, hello, everyone, and especially Deepta, Laura, Melanie, and hi, Julie. I'll start by just reading a little bit. I'm glad you're here and have enjoyed your presentations. I'll start with your synopsis, and then we'll go into, you can talk about your work. So Melanie's project is called Ancient Light, Rematerializing the Astronomical Image. Melanie is a Ph.D. candidate at the Royal College of Art, London. Her research takes on a special focus of anatomy and the many entanglements between humans and the cosmos. As a founder of the London Alternative Photography Collective, Melanie is dedicated to finding, using, and developing sustainable practices for the printed image, both beyond analog and the digital workflows, with their many damaging ecological impacts. Much of her photographic practice is experimental. She has many professional accomplishments, and she's a lecturer at the Royal College of Art and the University of West London, as well as being a tutor in photography at Canterbury Christ Church University. Julie Jamond, her project is called Becoming World, Reimagining the Material Self. Julie is a Canadian artist working on a research creation-based Ph.D. at Brock University in the Interdisciplinary Humanities program. She is aligned with various intersecting movements emerging in the 1960s, including performance-based video, body, and land art. She aims to explore a profound connection with the natural world by probing edges, areas of merging between identity and environment, interiority, exteriority, tamed, and wild. Her practice looks at ways landscape imprints itself on and through the skin. Laura Denning and Deepta Sateesh, their project is called Wet Ontologies. Laura has recently defended her doctoral thesis from the Bath Spa University in England in environmental humanities. She's a transdisciplinary artist working across film, sound, social participation, and installation. Her practice-led research positions art practice with experimental geography in order to open up the registers within which art might operate, and to foreground environmental and ecological focus in her art practice. Most of her work aims to reveal novel insights that can contest familiar ways of thinking about people, place, and sensation. Deepta has been awarded her PhD from the Manipal University of Higher Education in Karnataka, India. Her research gathers situated practice, movement, and the politics of the colonial eye, and draws upon design, environmental humanities, and philosophy. Currently, she is founder and director of the WUDA, I hope I got that right, Institute at Manipal. Research and projects at the center are concerned with the environment and its inhabitants, oriented towards revealing and generating new possibilities and frameworks for nature-culture synchronicities. The WUDA Center is also framed by wet ontologies. Laura and Deepta's project explore moist, humid, damp, wet, soaked ecosystems of much of the region of India, specifically called the Western Ghats, and the southwest region of Devon in the estuary in England. Both of these areas are known to be the wettest in their countries. So I guess if you all want to talk a little bit about your work, and then after that, we'll go to questions.
So Colette, who do you want to go first? Yeah. You're muted, Colette.
Well, we could start in the order that I read the bios, maybe Melanie and then Julie and then Deepta and Laura. How does that sound?
That sounds good. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed Shahid's kind of talk about the non-linearity understanding of space. And I think my presentation will kind of lead on nicely from that. So I'm Melanie King, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Royal College of Art, as Colette said, and I run quite a few different collectives in terms of analog and experimental photography, astronomy, and generally art and science. And the research that I am kind of sharing today is from my PhD thesis, Ancient Light Rematerializing the Astronomical Image. And my research questions are: how can the field of astronomical photography, viewed through the lens of new materialism, alter our collective perception of ecology? And how does the entanglement of astronomy and materiality affect our perception of analog photographic processes? So within this time of ecological catastrophe, it is important to readdress our tangible material connection with the universe and our planet by analyzing this interaction between astronomy, new materialism, and photography. I hope to provide new insights on how this collision of theories alters our understanding of the natural world. And I do this by demonstrating the interconnectedness between the universe, humans, and photographic materiality. I discuss the importance of interrogating the materials that we use on a daily basis, with a specific focus on waste produced by the photographic industry. Analog astronomical photography, viewed through the lens of new materialism, uniquely allows us to understand the intimate connection between the cosmos and the Earth bound. Silver is found within distant stars, yet it can be mined from the depths of our Earth and used to create photographic images. Calcium is found within stars, such as our sun, yet it is also a building block of bones and teeth, which can be processed to make gelatin. I'm also working in reflective practice and using situated knowledge as a kind of methodology for my work. And I draw from theorists such as Jane Bennett, Karen Barad, Donna Haraway, and Robin Wall-Kimmerer to kind of understand material exchanges from a perspective informed by contemporary science, as well as ancient indigenous perspectives. So by understanding more about the interconnected nature of photographic and astronomical materiality, I believe it is imperative to innovate new methods of sustainable photographic practice. So within my research, I'm using lots of different sustainable photographic processes, including making my own developer from items surrounding me, such as seaweed and mint and rosemary, but also reclaiming silver from photographic fix using electrolysis and taking it out of the water systems. So the chapter that I focused on within my talk was very much focused on this kind of new materialist theory, but also the kind of sustainable photographic practices that I work with. And yeah, I'll pass on to the next speaker now.
Which would be Julie. Hello, Julie.
Thank you for that, Melanie, and thank you, Colette, for the introduction. And hello to my fellow panelists and audience members. Thank you for being here. As Colette mentioned, these feel like very early days in the life of my project. I completed my PhD coursework last spring and have just commenced the rather daunting process of the daunting 10-week process of writing my comprehensive exams, after which I will finally be able to dedicate all my time and energy to my research creation project. So with that being said, my research is really powered by the materiality of the body and its entanglement with the physical world. My aim is to execute work that draws on my MFA thesis project called Imprint. And Imprint takes the form of a performance-based video. It addresses the relationship between two landscapes, so one outside the self and the other within. It uses the body as a conduit and a canvas, and considers the intrinsic nature of this dynamic by imprinting the landscape upon human skin. So this interplay of interior and exterior is one of the elements from Imprint that I've carried over to my PhD research. So my work understands the skin as a physical membrane that sheds and reconstitutes itself continually. So a sort of permeable, shifting parameter. In other words, we let the world in whether we want to or not. And I plan to address this vulnerability through Stacy Alimo's concept of transcorporeality, which emphasizes the human body as a site across which substances and forces are constantly crossing, and by which human beings are inseparable from the environment. So this means that we are both physically vulnerable, but also responsible to other beings. Now, as the concept of transcorporeality relates specifically to nature and the environment, it encourages us to think or to reimagine questions of environmental ethics and practices as deeply personal. And this kind of thinking sort of changes how we move around in the world. We begin to think through the fact that there are myriad harmful and invisible substances that we come into contact with on a daily basis. But not all transcorporeal exchanges are necessarily troubling. Pleasure too can spiral through these material encounters. And so the purpose of my work is not merely to register the discord between bodies and the environment, but also to seek to ameliorate or harmonize it. I am very interested in the notion of hypersensitive bodies, which I think work to blur the edges of the autonomous, self-contained human figure of Western liberal humanism. I really like the idea of reframing the hypersensitive body as a highly calibrated instrument of perception, a kind of thin-skinned, exceedingly responsive, perhaps overly or hyper human. For example, those who suffer from environmental illness or multiple chemical sensitivity, as it's often called, might be considered as possessing powers of clairvoyance or supernatural awareness. Like canaries in coal mines, their knowledge might be perceived as a warning for those who do not or cannot sense the danger. Now, intuitive thinking is definitely at play here, which has historically been aligned with the emotional and sensual experiences of the body, and thus often relegated to the status of the subjective. But my research, as many of the projects at this symposium do, endeavors to achieve a kind of equilibrium between intellect and intuition, as I think both are necessary for developing new and integrative approaches. So I believe, as Bertrand Russell does, that the union of the intuitive and the empirical is our most promising conduit to truth. For intuitive thinking offers a powerful complement to the scientific lens on reality. Now, at this time, as I mentioned, the creative component remains nebulous in form. I'm quite sure it'll crystallize as a multi-channel audiovisual installation consisting of 6 videos, and each video will be devoted to a participant with whom I'll work over the course of roughly 2 years. The videos will be sort of diaristic in nature. They'll document conversations and explorations of the participants' personal bodily experiences in and of the physical world. And then the narrative that emerges from these explorations will be interpreted collaboratively by the participant and myself into a storied performance. I imagine a kind of dance of sorts. So I think I'll leave it at that because my timer is a little bit over the 5-minute mark.
Thank you, Julie. So now Deepta and Laura, let's hear about your project.
Hi there, I'm Laura. I'll kick off. Just to explain really how Deepta and I have been working collaboratively. We've used the pandemic really successfully to collaborate online and meet regularly and to explore each other's ideas, looking at the overlaps. And so we embarked upon quite a gentle collaboration to begin with that is really building up momentum, where essentially we realized that we had walking and water as really strong themes within our work. And so we used these themes to explore our environments and to share what we discovered with each other. And for this particular presentation, we've brought together a video that brought together these discoveries into a video that I think breaks down into 5 different sections, where we basically compare and contrast as a starting point for other ways to collaborate going forward. And so we're also currently looking, maybe our next moves, bringing on board what we've already been working with, which might be described as poetics and notions of embodiment, to focus on temporal dimensions of our collaboration. Deepta is in India and I'm in the UK, but also temporal in the sense that we both have a focus on the lunar, and we're interested in exploring after dark and dark skies to see where that goes. And I'm about a week away from submitting my revisions and finally getting that much coveted doctorate. And so I'm in the middle of a text and I've come across a quote that I find I've actually repeated 5 times, but that's another issue, that I'd like to share with you by an academic scholar called Simonson, who in 2007 talked about embodiment as the geography closest in. And I'll just share this quote with you. When the body is seen as the geography closest in, a constitutive social spatiality, reaching out towards other socio-spatial scales, from local configurations to transnational connections, it is exactly what is at stake. Different and multi-scalar practices are characterized by different rhythms between which there are both mergings, clashings, and interferences. Spatial entities, places, cities, then become loci of encounters, outcomes, and multiple becomings. They are meeting points, moments, or conjectures where social practices and trajectories meet up with moving and fixed materialities and form configurations that are continuously under transformation and negotiation. So, over to Deepta.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. And as Laura said, this has been sort of a building up. I think it's been about almost a year now since we've been chatting, less frequently earlier and much more frequently more recently. And I just wanted to add a little thing about the walking as a practice. I think one of the things that sort of came out of my own doctoral research, where Laura and I found a meeting point, was that walking is really a meta practice, and it's a very material engagement in the world. It includes notions of new ways of recording situatedness, looking at movement as something that is intrinsic to understanding ecologies. And of course, looking at wetness and not looking at it, but really immersing in it. And that would be multiple conditions of wetness, whether it's just mist or even sweat. So all the way from the skin to the atmospheric transformations. But I think the movement is really more about also, it allows to observe change in an environment, but also observe change of self moving through an environment. And so it becomes part of a learning, actually. And one of the things that from my own research that came out was I also talk about the notions of walking and wandering. For me, wandering is really also about wandering through fields of knowledge that have been constructed and fixed through a colonial lens versus walking as a way to disrupt it in that sense. And I think what I'd like to do is just read my my thesis question, so you can kind of see where it comes from in one sense. I suggest that my thesis is that the environmental conflicts in the Western Ghats, which is, as Colette said, is one of the wettest parts of India, arise from an inherited picture of place described in a quasi-scientific language. And I look at the quasi-scientific language specifically in as being constructed of the disciplines of geography, geology, botany, and economics that construct the nature and the understanding of the Western Ghats as a region. I use the language the use of the language can be traced back to colonial texts, but the roots of the imaging behind it are much more difficult to unravel, being embedded in articulations of geographic texts, object drawings, literature, and performing arts that have structured a lens with coastlines and contours, species and material systems, hierarchies and classification systems. This lens or imaging, which tends to be assumed by both sides of the conflict, which is development and conservation in the Western Ghats today, I propose is a work of design. And I actually began to explore this, this making of this image, beginning with an investigation of an epic novel written by an author in that region called Malikarali Madamagalu, which means Bride of the Hills. And it's really a love story. And it tells the tale of a rich tapestry of the Malnad region, the rainforest, human relationships and practices, and categories of species, sites and landscapes and socioeconomic hierarchies. It also reveals the possibility of another imaging, that of the unseen of the inhabitant, of a particular engagement in the terrain. And in the novel, everybody walks, and it's set in the late 1800s. So walking sort of begins there as well. So the question really is, can the current articulating lens be distinguished from the imaging behind the descriptive text? And can it contribute to the critical examination of the portrayal of place that has hitherto passed unnoticed and made invisible, being outside of the frame of the conflicts and discourse of critical fields such as development and conservation? So even the video that we made together, a lot of the elements come out of some of these questions as well, bringing in, looking at archival work as well to see where this image was constructed and what happens when you disrupt it. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And now we're going to open it to all kinds of questions. I did prepare a question, but you can ignore it. It's just that there's so much wonderful information in your presentations. And there's also a lot of connections. So I'll just put this out there, but of course you can talk about anything you want to and people can ask anything. What I was thinking about in listening to your works is that Laura and Deepta frame their work using the concept from Astrida Nimana's, the hydrofeminism, Astrida Nimani's hydrofeminism, that the human body is 2/3 water, and that all life has emerged from the sea. This idea problematizes conventional notions of skin boundaries, all skin boundaries from all bodies, not only human ones. Their work also reflects on connections between the sun and the moon and bodies of water, and by extension, the ecosystems and all of their inhabitants. Julie's work explores the porousness of the skin as a boundary where the interior world leaves imprints, traces, and sensations on skin surfaces, but also on interior spaces. Melanie's Ancient Light project investigates the human cosmic boundary in the plenitude of our material connections. Does planet Earth have skin? Also inherent in her work is the camera's visibility, seeing as the eye sees, that can give us the possibility to transport ourselves through time and space and to imagine through cosmic gazing, connectivity of evolutionary humans, moderns, and infinite cultural practices between the two. Considered together, your individual projects can be viewed as different kinds of dances, each one at play with the appearance of unique, individualized, boundaried existences, while their often hidden realities are profoundly enmeshed, entangled, and promiscuous. Can you elaborate on these both visible and invisible, boundaried and unboundaried relations?
I think I can start by going first. I think from my perspective, and learning about the kind of our kind of new understanding of quantum physics, that helps us to try and understand more about the kind of quantum boundaries that exist. And that has been very helpful for me to kind of imagine how we might be more connected than we previously thought. And yeah, and extending that kind of out into the cosmos, if that makes sense.
Also, Colette, you mentioned Neymanis's essay Hydrofeminism and the book Bodies of Water, and she says so many things in there, but she talks about, she was the first person who revealed to me, at least, that the waters within and around ourselves now are the same waters that have been here since the beginning of time and will continue to be the same waters going into the unknown future. And so that circularity, which is messy and uncontainable and unpredictable, perhaps is in part what is both visible and invisible. Yeah, there's a lot to say to that.
I could add, I think, about the notions. One is, of course, the hydrological sensibility, which in the video that we made, there are parts where actually the video is not just in the Western Ghats. It was intended to be in the Swarna estuary, which is west in the Arabian Sea. But because of the lockdown, I actually took a lot of footage here in Bangalore, which is there's no rivers or sea or anything here, but there are lots of tanks, and it's a whole other tank system here, which is slowly being erased. But I sort of look at in the video here in Bangalore, I sort of start to look at the notions of boundaries in terms of the colonial boundaries, which has sort of enclosed the forest through which I walk. So that's one boundary that I begin to question. And in India, there's a word which we use, which is pakka, which means finished or complete, or in a final state, versus kacha, which is sort of in the making or becoming unfinished. And so I use those words in the video to sort of distinguish between the fixed and the fluid or unknown in that sense, in terms of boundaries which can change, or temporal ways in which communities actually sort of, how do you say, dissuade movement through, although they can't control it so much. And I think one of the interesting things was that even in the video sections, I moved from Bangalore to the Western Ghats actually, because there's also like Astrid Neymanis says, and Laura also just reiterated, that the waters are the same. So when the monsoon is coming from the west coast, it inhabits and engulfs the southern peninsula of India. And so for me, there's no real boundary between Bangalore and the coast in that sense, because we're all in the rain in the monsoon at the same time. And we're sort of, inhabiting this moist, humid, cold also sometimes in Bangalore in that sense. Yeah.
I don't have too much to add other than what I have already said in my presentation, but I'm sort of eager to ask Laura and Deepta, or make a comment and ask a question, if that's okay, if we shift gears. Laura and Deepta, I really loved your presentation, in particular, the layering of images, and especially the footage of walking and wandering through landscapes, which I responded to kinetically. It was really inspiring. And the quick tempo and the shifting back and forth between landscapes and themes really sort of kept me on my toes. Your presentation made me wonder about kind of aesthetics that could essentially work to renegotiate the role of human agency and human-earth relations and to disrupt this notion of the centrality and the self-containment of the human being. And I really saw your presentation more as a film, like a sort of experimental form of documentary, which I'm very interested in. It brought to mind the ontoepistemology of Karen Barad, in which your film could really be considered knowledge itself, by which I mean it doesn't only communicate knowledge, but it embodies it. And so the aesthetic choices you made, including the perspective of the cameras, the cuts, the layering and collaging effects, this interplay of techniques, I think, could be sort of considered as the creation of situated knowledge, which I think you were sort of alluding to in what you were just speaking about. So as an example, like your collaging technique sort of challenges the perception of nature as holistic, presenting instead a shattered or fragmented image. And this, for me anyway, evoked the principle of becoming and undoing on a visual plane. And so I just sort of wondered if, or hoped that you could talk a little bit about your aesthetic approach and collaboration in the process of making this presentation / experimental film.
Julie, I mean, I have to say that if I ever need somebody to review anything I've ever done, I'm going straight to you. And that was such a wonderful set of things to say. Thank you very much. I feel quite humbled. And I love the idea of experimental documentary. I've sort of been exploring film in different ways over the last year in particular, within a collective setting. And experimental geography is very much part of my research. So bringing those two together in that way isn't a perception I'd had before. So I'm grateful for that insight. I am renowned for being horribly honest, and I will admit that perhaps the aesthetic, speaking for myself, comes from not feeling like I'm in control of the technology that allows me to produce a final outcome. That every time I put things together, it's, oh, that's what it does. It looks like that, okay. And so in that sense, it is deeply experimental. And I guess once you've learnt 2 or 3 little maneuvers within Adobe software or any kind of software, you stick with them for a bit. And I guess perhaps that then in this short film gives an overall aesthetic. And I think also there was an excess of not just information, but experience and response to the environment that I personally wanted to share, and to try and cram that all into something linear felt unnatural, and as though I was being muted when I'd only just got started. So the idea of sort of collaging those different aspects allowed me to just get it all off my chest. So that was my aesthetic. And then also the aesthetic was also in response to the work that Deepta was producing simultaneously. We were swapping each other's work on a weekly, daily basis for some time, and trying then to think, oh, how did she do that? And I really like what's happening there. How can I try and mirror that? And so it became also a dialogue. And therefore, I guess if it does come across as situated knowledge, that's just so amazing. But it feels, from the point of view of the constructor of that, one of the the co-collaborator of that product, to be less confident in its articulations than it might appear, and perhaps that's one of its strengths. Anyway, I'm sure Deepta's got plenty to say.
No, I mean, I thank you so much, Julie, for those very kind words. And I also agree. I mean, I think agree with Laura, because it just seems very experimental and raw at the moment, for me at least. And but it's feels like the beginning of something that can grow and extend into all kinds of ideas of presentation, representation, and I think, to be honest, actually, this was the first time I've ever made a video. So I had to learn the software and all of that stuff. And as Laura said, I did learn a lot from her as well, because she's, Laura's been making videos much longer than I have. But having said that, I did use my camera a lot during my own thesis work. So, I mean, that was the way in which I recorded field work. And for me, because walking was a material practice, I had to figure out a way of walking and recording. And I had like many kinds of categories of things that I was looking for, which are not disciplinary, but really coming out of the novel and the novel's formulation, or the kinds of things that are described when walking is happening. So it's really about sort of constructing, I guess the aesthetic. The aesthetics comes from that complexity of looking at ideas of time, whether it's the lunar cycle or just the morning, or the time of walking itself as a practice, that time is embedded in a practice rather than time being outside or the measure of something. And there was also materials and material textures, looking for wetness. And I think so for me, and I'm also a dancer, so for me, my feet do a lot of the work. And I guess it's the first tactile material engagement with the world with the feet. So my camera is always mostly tilted down, and I just walk. I don't know what the camera is actually capturing until later, in that sense. But I've captured all kinds of things, including conversations with anti-Naxal police and all kinds of things. So it's also a very non-intrusive way when the camera is facing down, so nobody really knows they're capturing things in one sense. Of course, there are ethical issues with that, but I think it's really interesting because there's some choppiness as well in some of the footage that I've put together, and I think that's also coming from the bombardment from the environment, also the different kinds of things that you experience in one moment, and to be able to share that is really difficult, because experience cannot be really captured in its wholeness. But perhaps we can do this kind of work in order to at least destabilize the dominant ways of representation that sort of engulf our knowledge systems in that sense. So I think that's where it comes from. Yeah. I also wanted to sort of perhaps ask you a question, Julie, as well, because one of the things that I really resonated with in your video also is this notion of, one is the notion of performance, but also the hypersensitivity, which is really a certain kind of sensibility as well, that you become attuned to sensing or feeling things that are happening, around. So I was wondering if you could sort of expand a little bit about how you sort of thought through that. And the other question I had was, in the video, you also choose thorns as a way of mark making, I suppose, on your skin. And so I guess, what led you to the choice of thorns versus something that doesn't make marks per se? Or, I mean, I feel for me it was not necessarily seen in a negative way in any way, perhaps.
Yes, thank you for these questions. In response to the second part, the thorns, those images were taken in the Sonoran Desert in Arizona, and it was really the first kind of iteration of that project imprint. And I had found that during my MFA, which I did in Toronto, I found that I was really feeling, being in the city, really cut off from the natural world. I was feeling like I I think all city environments have always done this to me. They've sort of made it impossible for me to think abstractly or to think creatively. And so I felt sort of numbed during the process. And then I would have this really jarring experience where I would go from Toronto to this really remote area in the beautiful Sonoran Desert. And I think I just sort of expected things to start happening there, to start feeling, not even necessarily healed, but just connected to something outside of that very sort of industrial or academic or intellectual world that I had been occupying. And it just didn't happen that way. I struggled. It was such a challenge for me. And so I think that that's what led me to making these marks and trying to sort of through the pain, trying to sort of shock myself into feeling again. I think probably a lot of us could relate to that numbness at times in our lives. And then your other question what was it about performance?
Hypersensitivity.
Oh yeah, hypersensitivity. Yes, I can also really speak from a sort of personal place on the hypersensitivity. I suppose, I think also when I talk about hypersensitivity, I'm sort of cautious, or I feel a little bit cautious about drawing a line between people who are hypersensitive and people who are not. I think everyone has sensitivities to varying degrees, but I do consider myself probably a person that has more of a hypersensitivity to the environment, and this interest really stemmed out of an experience I had 6 years ago now, where I was on actually an artist residency retreat, and we were walking up this creek bed, and there was many of us, one of us stepped on a rock that underneath of which was a yellow jacket nests, or a series of yellow jacket nests. So they all came out and basically attacked my whole party. And it was complete pandemonium. Most people got stung once or twice, including myself. But I went into anaphylactic shock. And it was really a shock because I didn't know that I was allergic. So I had this whole very traumatic experience. And in that case, I sort of knew the culprit. I knew what I was sensitive to. But I guess I was thinking that there was a time prior to that event that my body in some ways was keeping secrets from me. It had this kind of allergy, this secret allergy that I wasn't aware of, or that I was only aware of, physically. So yeah, that got me thinking a lot about environmental illness and people who are constantly trying to navigate their sensitivities to the world and not even necessarily knowing where they're coming from, because our environments are so complex, and we have all of these sort of natural allergies to our pollen allergies, or I guess my yellow jacket allergy would be considered a natural, as opposed to manufactured chemicals, for example. Or I have a friend that is very sensitive to Wi-Fi and 5G. So yeah, that's kind of where that came from.
Okay, well, maybe we want to open it up to questions from everybody. now. Does that sound okay, Flounder? We open it up to questions from the group.
Sure.
Yes, if there are none, I have one for Melanie lined up. Just saying. So I'll.
You can go quite. I have a question for Melanie too, but I'm just conscious of space, so I want everybody's work to be have an opportunity for everybody to comment. So please go ahead, Julie.
Are you sure, Colette? I feel like I've sort of been hogging the.
No, go on. No, please.
Okay.
There's one from Kate.
Okay, let's do that then, because I really feel like I'm.
I felt like I should be giving space to you, Julie, because it's your panel. But I do have a question for Melanie. So I'd just like to ask, just a real question about your images, and you spoke about in your presentation, you spoke about your trip to the Alps, your 2013 trip to the Alps, and you showed a photograph of rock strata, which you explained contains vast tracts of time, and how this sparked, how this sort of sparked ideas in you. And I was thinking about the really, really beautiful images that you showed in your presentation that you're currently presenting using more sustainable practices. Cathanol, and so that an image of the moon that's been tinted by cathanol, and kind of particularly the prints using seawater and seaweed, the drowned landscapes, and the images deteriorating because they can't be made fixed or stable, and then the microbes eating the gelatin, which I just loved. And it felt like when I was looking at those images, it felt, you spoke about that original, the rock strata containing vast tracts of time, and I felt like when I was looking at your current photographs, that I'm looking at distant futures, like in the now. And I wondered about if you're invested in your acceptance of non-archival, like that conventional sense of archival image making as necessary, and you know how that kind of chimes or echoes with the impermanence, certainly of the place that you say that you're living in, and the impermanence for all of us as well, like that, just, and that kind of thing of the future appearing in those images that you've produced.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone. It's been really interesting so far. But yeah, that was a really interesting question. I would say that I am invested in thinking more about this obsession with photography as a kind of thing that needs to be fixed. I kind of see it in line with other areas of contemporary art, which are more focused on kind of the understanding of materiality and the acceptance that they will transform and change over time. And I find that does chime a little bit with this idea of thinking of materiality on a cosmic scale. So thinking about how our Earth might change over thousands or millions of years, and thinking how the cosmos changes over thousands of or millions of years. And yeah, just thinking about transformation of materiality on a really kind of large astronomical magnitude, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really lovely answer. Thank you.
I also had a question for Julia. I just wondered if you could say more about the idea of the human being a highly calibrated instrument. I thought that was really interesting.
Yes, I think that was inspired by, again, something that Stacey Alimo had said in one of her recent publications. But yes, I think part of the problem with hypersensitivity, or I use environmental illness a lot because well, it has to do with hypersensitive individuals to varying degrees. So I think that there's some sort of knowledge that can be trapped in the body, and I was sort of speaking to this before, like an occult kind of knowledge that in some ways, in many ways, is almost impossible to articulate, and in other ways is almost, I think a lot of us are sort of resistant to kind of share our pain in that kind of way, because it's ours, you know, but we want people to understand it, but we also sort of want to own it. It's our pain. It becomes sort of precious in this strange way. So yeah, I feel like I'm really interested in this idea of like embodied research and using the body as a way to somehow kind of express, even if it's just fragments of the knowledge that body contains. And I think that probably for me and for many of us, the best way to do that is through artistic practice. Yeah, I find it very difficult to write about effectively, but I think that in many ways we can use aesthetics as a way to kind of express that knowledge, and I'm just kind of thinking, I'm not really answering your question, instruments of perception, but I will just say that I think I'll just leave it at that. I've sort of answered your question, yeah, but it's kind of beat around the bush a bit.
I also have a question for Melanie. I was particularly taken with, like Kate was, with the idea that developer has agency. And I really loved the work that you did with seaweed in particular. But I was really also hungry, I guess, to hear what you had to say about hope within your presentation. And I wondered if you could, I don't know, feed my appetite again by saying more on the theme of hope within your work.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I first started to think about in terms of hope was, what am I doing? Just doing very small kind of contributions to making photography more sustainable. It's quite a small scale thing. It's just me. It's kind of me just doing the work. There's lots of other people using sustainable photographic processes, but it feels quite small and kind of a grand scale. But then I've been very much inspired by other thinkers and writers who kind of talk about hope as a way to move forward in times of darkness, like in this kind of climate catastrophe that we're in. It can sometimes seem that there's not many ways forward, but I think making these small acts really helps personally, but I think it can also help into a bigger picture if we all do kind of small things, that even if it's just going on a litter pick or something like that, it's contributing to this greater movement towards sustainability over the whole world. So yeah, and I've been really inspired by people like Rebecca Solnit, who talks about hope in the dark, and and Donna Haraway's idea of staying with the trouble and trying to kind of face all of these scary ecological catastrophes and not kind of shy away from it.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, small forms of collective activism can really build on that hope, can't they? Even if they're seemingly geographically dispersed, just as we're all in this room now, we're geographically, physically dispersed. But in a sense, in the sharing of our knowledges and our insights, there are activisms taking place and being born, and that all feeds into that the usefulness of hope in keeping us going, really, in the face of all those crises. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. And one thing that I'm really excited about is I'm part of a group called the Sustainable Darkroom. And because so many of us are working on little different areas of making photography more sustainable, there is a genuine impact happening there. And who knows if it might be then adopted on a larger scale.
Hi, Melanie. There's a question in the chat from Andre. You might be interested in taking a look at that.
I'll read it out loud for the Facebook audience. And it says, Melanie, I loved your prints and photographs using seaweeds. I felt so inspired. I was wondering if you're planning to document the advancing tides and waves onto where you live in the near future. We are usually flooded with documentation of retracting glaciers, so your images and how you make them sure feel an important addition to that, the indeterminacy of the image, the media, and the landscapes.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I absolutely am planning to document the advancing tides, and I think it is advancing already on a very kind of slow scale, but I think that will become it will become exponential in the next couple of years. And I'm also taking part in a residency with a group called Spacer, who are based near where I live, and we're really looking at the genuine climate. We're kind of working with researchers and environmentalists in the area to see how that impact is going to happen, and the kind of specifics of that, as well as continuing to document the landscape in lots of different ways, not just photography. And I think that is very much inspired by this idea of situated knowledge and trying to understand more about the landscape by spending time in the landscape, but also trying to respond to not just the visual, but other senses as well, and other feelings that might come across. And I think that connects with what some of you guys are also saying about walking as a practice as well. And I loved what you said, Deepta, about walking as a material practice. Thought that was really beautiful.
That's great. I want to also encourage more questions from everybody.
At the risk of dominating, do tell me to shut up if I am, but I do have a question for Julie. And I first of all want to say how much I loved the final, I guess it was an animation film photographic piece at the end of your presentation of the hand within nature. That was really beautiful. So I'm looking forward to seeing how your work develops through your research. I also totally connect with the concept of research creation, which is something I've had to fight for with my very Anglophile supervisors, but hey. The question I wanted to ask you was around a point you made with regards to transcorporeality and the notion that we are simultaneously vulnerable and responsible, which comes back almost to that notion of a porous membrane that holds us in, and that's either something that holds us in an embrace, if you like, or stops us engaging more fully. with the world around us. And I don't know, I guess I wondered whether you wanted to share more about how you perceive the vulnerable responsible binary.
Well, I do just want to say that video clip that you were referring to it's actually video. It's not an animation. But thank you for your comments, your kind comments. I don't know if this is going to answer your question, but it actually made me think of something that I was considering before when you were answering my original question, which is this sort of the boundary as something that potentially limits us, but also in some creative ways enables us to act in certain ways. And I was thinking when you were talking about technology and putting together your video for this symposium, that there are these kinds of ways that technology, either due to the device itself or our, where the edge of our knowledge is in terms of that technology. So those limitations, how they kind of, how they're not always limitations, how when we're sort of coming to something new or when we're butting up against the edge of our knowledge, we sort of find ourselves in maybe this liminal space a little bit where we can be creative, and we can, that might be more generative than, say, if we had expert knowledge of that technology and were able to sort of create anything that we wanted. So that doesn't really answer your question. It sort of inspired a different answer, a different response. And I'm cautious to take up too much more time because I see that we're sort of coming to the end. So
I think Flounder said that we have a little bit of a grace period. So I think Flounder will hopefully let us know if we're getting to the end of our time. But I think there's a little bit of space left. And Deepta and then Shreed have questions. Deepta, I'm not quite sure who your question is directed to, but maybe you can unmute.
Yeah, the palimpsest was really in response to sorry, there's an aircraft flying over, it's kind of loud. In responding to the previous comments actually in the chat box about the notion of material grounds and geological formations, in that sense that we're sort of looking, the notion of time in these material understandings also, that rather than looking at how the past continues to define a present and future, Shreed mentioned that, sort of put in the comment that maybe the future is defining the past, but I would also probably suggest that if we engage in the present moment, the present moment of engagement can unravel both multiple pasts and multiple futures that are ephemeral, that are temporal, and just based on a situated engagement in that sense. So the palimpsest would really be about the now, the engagement in the present, and how that begins to form, I guess, to begin to form an understanding of multiple makings of that moment, multiple trajectories that come to make that moment, that connect the past with the future in that sense. So actually, for me, I would really suggest that we look at the now and what is happening right now in the contemporary to understand the past and understand or imagine new futures as well. So that would be, that's my response to that.